By the winter of 1942, Germany was no longer expanding its war. It was absorbing it. Maps were redrawn less often. Briefings grew quieter. And somewhere between expectation and necessity, the Reich began to look for safety instead of victory. This channel examines World War II through the moments when assumptions hardened, decisions narrowed, and history moved forward with fewer options than anyone expected. If you're new here, consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. In September 1939, Germany entered the Second World War with a theory of war that had already proven itself twice. In Poland, and then in France in May and June of 1940, the Wehrmacht demonstrated that speed, coordination, and concentrated force could dismantle larger armies before they fully understood what was happening to them. The results appeared decisive. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force escaped at Dunkirk, but without its heavy equipment. The campaigns reinforced an institutional belief that had been forming inside the German army since the interwar years, that modern war would be short, violent, and resolved by maneuver rather than endurance. This belief was not reckless. It was grounded in experience. German officers had studied the stalemate of the First World War closely. They had concluded that attrition favored industrial powers and coalitions, not continental states with limited access to raw materials. Speed, therefore, was not merely tactical preference. It was strategic necessity. The faster a war could be decided, the less Germany would have to test its economic limits. By 1940, that assumption appeared validated. The Wehrmacht's armored force was not built around invulnerability. German tanks in 1939 and 1940 were, by most technical measures, inferior to several of their potential adversaries. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were lightly armored, mechanically stressed, and designed to fight as part of combined formations rather than as independent fortresses. What they lacked in protection, they compensated for with doctrine. German armored units emphasized coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support. Radios were standard. Commanders were trained to improvise with an intent. When confronted with resistance, units bypassed it. When gaps appeared, they were exploited before higher headquarters could respond. The system rewarded initiative, not endurance. This doctrine shaped how German planners understood risk. Tanks were not expected to survive repeated direct hits. Crews were expected to move, reposition, and overwhelm opponents before those opponents could respond effectively. Vulnerability was accepted as the cost of speed. For the first 2 years of the war, the calculation held. But by the summer of 1941, the assumptions that supported it began to strain. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The scale of the campaign exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had attempted before. 3 army groups advanced across a front stretching more than 1,800 miles. Initial successes were dramatic. Entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Yet even as German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, signs of friction appeared. Distances were longer than anticipated. Roads were worse. Supply columns lagged. Vehicles broke down faster than replacement parts could arrive. Soviet resistance, though disorganized, did not collapse. It retreated, regrouped, and returned. By the autumn of 1941, German armored units were still advancing, but they were no longer racing. They were pushing. The Red Army introduced new equipment into the battlefield environment, equipment German crews had not expected to encounter in large numbers. The T-34 medium tank, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, proved difficult to destroy with standard German anti-tank weapons at normal combat ranges. Soviet anti-tank rifles, crude but numerous, penetrated the thinner armor of German vehicles from close distances. For the first time since 1939, German tank crews began to feel exposed. According to after-action reports from late 1941, crews increasingly described engagements not in terms of maneuver, but in terms of survivability. Vehicles were lost not because they were outflanked, but because they were simply hit, often from directions that could not be immediately identified. The German response was initially doctrinal, not technical. Crews were instructed to avoid close engagement. Units were reminded to rely on artillery and air support. Tactical adjustments were made, but the underlying assumption remained intact: speed and coordination would compensate for vulnerability. Then winter arrived. By December 1941, temperatures on the Eastern Front dropped well below freezing. Lubricants thickened. Engines seized. Infantry froze in place. The Red Army, better adapted to the conditions and fighting closer to its logistical base, counterattacked. German armor did not collapse, but it did not dominate either. In January 1942, as German forces stabilized their lines, internal assessments began to change in tone. Reports from the front increasingly emphasized losses sustained through direct fire rather than maneuver defeat. Requests for heavier armor became more frequent. The language shifted subtly, from speed to protection, from initiative to endurance. These were not panic reactions. They were institutional recalculations. Germany's leadership understood the broader context. By early 1942, the war had expanded beyond Europe. The United States had entered the conflict in December 1941. British industry remained intact. Soviet production, relocated east of the Urals, was accelerating. Germany was now engaged in a war of scale. This reality placed pressure on the assumptions that had guided German armored development up to that point. The existing tank force had been optimized for wars that ended quickly. But the war Germany was now fighting showed no indication of ending soon. Inside the German High Command, the problem was framed less as defeat and more as exposure. The Wehrmacht had not lost its ability to fight. It had lost the feeling of control. What Germany required, increasingly, was not simply a better weapon. It required reassurance, something that could restore confidence at the tactical level and signal resolve at the strategic one. By mid-1942, that requirement began to crystallize around a machine already under development. A tank designed not for speed, but for dominance. Not for maneuver, but for presence. The assumption was simple, and dangerously persuasive, that superior protection and firepower could compensate for numerical inferiority, and restore the psychological balance that Germany felt slipping away. From here on, German armored doctrine would move in only one direction. By the spring of 1942, the German army was no longer debating whether the war had changed. It was debating how much. The question was not asked publicly, and rarely framed directly in staff meetings, but it appeared consistently in memoranda, procurement requests, and technical correspondence. What would it take to feel safe again? The answer was not speed. Speed had worked when enemies collapsed on contact, when roads were intact, when air superiority could be assumed, and when resistance dissolved faster than it could organize. None of those conditions applied on the Eastern Front by early 1942. Soviet forces were absorbing losses and returning. Front lines bent but did not break. Engagements lasted longer. Firepower mattered more than tempo. This altered how German planners interpreted vulnerability. Tank losses were no longer understood primarily as tactical errors. They were increasingly attributed to material insufficiency. Reports from armored divisions described vehicles that had performed correctly, followed doctrine, and still failed to survive contact. The implication was subtle but profound, that correct behavior was no longer enough. According to internal assessments circulated in early 1942, German armored units faced an opponent willing to accept losses in exchange for proximity. Soviet anti-tank teams closed distance deliberately. Guns were in place not to maneuver, but to deny space. Attrition, once something Germany believed it could avoid, had become unavoidable. This created a psychological shift inside the armored force. Crews adapted their behavior. Tanks lingered behind cover longer than before. Commanders hesitated to push into uncertain terrain without infantry screens. Engagements opened at greater distances when possible. These adjustments were rational, but they carried an implicit admission that German tanks could no longer assume dominance by movement alone. At higher levels, the same pressure manifested differently. By early 1942, German industry faced mounting constraints. Raw materials were limited. Skilled labor was increasingly diverted to aircraft and submarines. The prospect of matching Allied tank production numerically was already dismissed as unrealistic. According to production estimates reviewed in Berlin in January and February 1942, the Soviet Union alone was projected to outproduce Germany in tanks by several multiples within the year. The conclusion was unavoidable. Germany would fight outnumbered. This reality elevated the importance of qualitative superiority from preference to necessity. If Germany could not build more tanks, then each tank would have to matter more. Each vehicle would need to dominate not one opponent, but several. Survivability was no longer a secondary consideration. It became central. The logic appeared sound. German military culture had long valued technical excellence. Precision engineering, disciplined crews, and centralized standards were understood as force multipliers. The idea that one superior system could compensate for numerical inferiority was not new. It had precedent in artillery, optics, and communications. In 1942, that belief migrated decisively into armored warfare. The project that would later be known as the Tiger tank had existed in various forms since 1937. It was not conceived as an emergency solution. Early designs envisioned a breakthrough vehicle to support infantry against fortified positions, a specialized role, not a universal answer. But as the strategic context narrowed, the interpretation of that design changed. By March 1942, correspondence between the Army Ordnance Office and industry increasingly emphasized armor thickness and gun caliber. Engagement ranges were recalculated. Penetration tables were revised. The goal was no longer to defeat enemy tanks under favorable conditions, but to render their weapons ineffective outright. This distinction mattered. A tank that could destroy an enemy was useful. A tank that could ignore the enemy's fire was transformative. The conceptual leap was psychological as much as technical. If a tank could be made effectively immune at common combat ranges, then crews could regain the confidence they had lost. Initiative could be restored not through maneuver, but through presence. The battlefield could be simplified again, reduced to distance and firepower. The appeal of this idea spread quickly. Reports from testing grounds in early 1942 highlighted armor plates that resisted known Soviet anti-tank guns. Trials emphasized survivability under sustained fire. Engineers measured not just penetration, but deformation, spalling, and crew safety. The language of evaluation shifted from performance to protection. Within this framework, weight became acceptable. Complexity became tolerable. Reliability issues were noted but deferred. The priority was clear: psychological dominance first, logistical efficiency later. By mid-1942, as German forces prepared for their summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, the heavy tank concept had evolved beyond its original intent. It was no longer simply a support vehicle. It was becoming a symbol of regained control, of restored hierarchy on the battlefield. The assumption underlying this shift was rarely stated outright, but it guided decisions nonetheless: that fear had been the problem, and that removing fear would restore effectiveness. Armor thickness became reassurance. Gun caliber became authority. Distance became safety. This belief did not arise from ignorance. It arose from pressure. Germany's leaders were not blind to the risks. They understood that heavier tanks would strain transport, fuel supply, and maintenance capacity. They knew that complexity invited failure. These concerns were recorded, discussed, and acknowledged. But by 1942, the range of acceptable choices had narrowed. Germany could not outproduce its enemies. It could not disengage. It could not shorten the war. What it could do was convince itself, and its soldiers, that superiority was still possible. The heavy tank promised exactly that. By August 1942, the first examples were ready for deployment. They were sent not in mass, but deliberately, to sectors where impact would be immediate and visible. Their role was not only to fight, but to be seen fighting. What followed was not just a change in equipment, but a change in belief. From this point on, German armored warfare would increasingly revolve around a single expectation: that protection could replace maneuver, and that dominance could be restored by steel alone. The war had not yet disproven that belief. But it had begun to test it. The Tiger tank entered combat not as part of a sweeping doctrinal reform, but as an intervention. Its arrival was meant to stabilize confidence at the point of contact, where German assumptions had begun to erode most visibly. The first Tigers were deployed in late August 1942, initially on the Eastern Front near Leningrad, and shortly afterward to North Africa. Their numbers were small. Fewer than a dozen vehicles were committed at a time. But they were not intended to be decisive through mass. They were intended to be decisive through presence. At 45 tons, the Tiger was unlike any German tank that had preceded it. Its frontal armor measured up to 100 mm thick. Its sides, reinforced beyond earlier standards, resisted weapons that had previously been lethal. This was not incremental improvement. It was categorical separation. For the crews assigned to it, the experience was immediate. German tank units had spent the previous year adapting to vulnerability. Crews learned to expect penetration from close range. They maneuvered cautiously, avoided static engagements, and relied heavily on supporting arms. The Tiger reversed that relationship. Inside it, crews no longer measured distance in terms of danger, but in terms of opportunity. According to combat reports from late 1942, Tiger crews described enemy fire not as a threat, but as confirmation. Hits were felt, heard, and registered, but not suffered. Shells struck the armor and failed. The sound became familiar. A dull, resonant impact. Steel on steel. The effect was not subtle. In post-war interviews and unit histories, Tiger crews consistently recalled the same sensory detail: the moment when incoming fire ceased to provoke urgency. One report from a heavy tank battalion on the Eastern Front noted that crews remained in position under fire longer than doctrine would normally allow, not out of necessity, but because the vehicle permitted it. This behavior was not ordered. It emerged organically. The Tiger altered how crews interpreted risk. Where earlier tanks encouraged movement as survival, the Tiger allowed stillness. It absorbed attention. Enemy gunners focused on it, often to their own detriment, while lighter German units maneuvered around the engagement. This reinforced the perception that the Tiger was not merely protected, but protective. In Tunisia, in early 1943, this perception hardened into legend. During a series of engagements against British forces, a single Tiger reportedly absorbed more than 200 hits from anti-tank weapons and artillery fragments before returning to base under its own power. The precise number varied across accounts, 200, 240, 252, but the detail that mattered was not numerical accuracy. It was survival. The story spread quickly. Whether fully accurate or not, it circulated through units, appeared in briefings, and was repeated in correspondence. It was referenced not as an anomaly, but as evidence. Evidence that the Tiger could endure punishment beyond reasonable expectation. Evidence that it could remain operational where other vehicles would have been destroyed several times over. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Crews who had previously measured engagements in seconds now measured them in minutes. Decisions slowed, not from hesitation, but from confidence. The Tiger allowed its operators to remain exposed in ways that would have been suicidal months earlier. This altered the tempo of combat. Where German doctrine once emphasized rapid penetration and exploitation, Tiger-led engagements increasingly resembled anchored confrontations. Tigers were positioned deliberately, often on commanding ground, to draw enemy fire and dominate approaches. The battlefield narrowed around them. The machine rewarded this behavior. Its armor reduced the cost of error. Its internal space insulated crews from immediate consequence. Even when damaged, Tigers often remained intact long enough for recovery or withdrawal. This created a feedback loop. Survival reinforced confidence, confidence encouraged exposure, exposure produced more survivable encounters. From the perspective of German command, this appeared as a solution. The Tiger restored something that had been slipping away since late 1941, the sense that German units could still dictate terms locally, even when outnumbered. It simplified engagements again. The complexity of maneuver gave way to the clarity of dominance. But this simplification came with trade-offs. The Tiger was not agile. Its weight strained bridges, transport vehicles, and engines. Mechanical failures were common, especially during early deployments. Recovery required specialized equipment. Fuel consumption was high. Mobility, the cornerstone of earlier German success, was compromised. These drawbacks were acknowledged in reports and staff discussions. But they were increasingly treated as acceptable costs. The Tiger was not judged by how often it broke down, but by how rarely it was penetrated. Protection became the metric. This recalibration was subtle but decisive. German armored warfare began to privilege survivability over flexibility. Tactical patience replaced rapid exploitation. The Tiger did not encourage reckless advance, but it did encourage reliance. Crews trusted it. Commanders built plans around it. Propaganda amplified its image. The Tiger was no longer just a tank. It was becoming a reference point, for safety, for authority, for restored hierarchy on the battlefield. The assumption now embedded itself deeply, that if a tank could not be killed easily, then the problem of being outnumbered could be managed. For a time, the battlefield seemed to agree. Enemy forces adapted, but slowly. Conventional anti-tank weapons proved ineffective at common ranges. Engagements required closer approach, heavier guns, or flanking maneuvers, all of which took time. Time the Tiger appeared to control. This reinforced the belief that the Tiger had solved a fundamental problem. But it also masked a growing dependency. German armored units were reorganizing their behavior around a machine that made them feel safe. Decisions were increasingly shaped by the expectation that protection would hold. Maneuver became secondary. Firepower and position took precedence. The Tiger had stabilized fear. In doing so, it began to reshape doctrine. And from this point forward, German armored planning would increasingly assume that distance and armor could substitute for adaptability. That assumption had not yet failed. But it had begun to narrow the war's available paths. If the Tiger's armor changed how German crews experienced danger, its gun changed how they understood control. Mounted inside the Tiger was the 88mm KWK-36, a weapon already burdened with reputation before it ever fired from a tank turret. The 88 had earned its authority earlier in the war as an anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun, most notably in North Africa and France. Its penetration capability was well documented. Its range was respected. By 1942, it was a known quantity. What changed was context. When placed inside a heavily armored turret, the 88 no longer functioned as a defensive measure or a reactive tool. It became an instrument of preemption. Tiger crews could engage enemy armor at distances that redefined the opening moments of battle. Combat reports from late 1942 and early 1943 consistently noted engagement ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, often approaching 2,000. At those distances, many Soviet and Allied tanks were either incapable of effective return fire or unable to identify the firing position before being struck. This altered the sequence of combat. Previously, German tank engagements unfolded through maneuver, contact, adjustment, flanking, suppression. With the Tiger, the sequence compressed. Detection became destruction. Observation became decision. Crews did not describe this shift in emotional terms. They described it procedurally. According to unit logs and after-action reports, Tiger commanders increasingly sought elevated ground and long sightlines. Hills, ridgelines, and open approaches were prioritized. Once positioned, the Tiger did not advance so much as it waited. The battlefield was allowed to come to it. This produced a distinct behavioral pattern. Tiger units began to operate as fixed points of dominance rather than mobile elements of a larger maneuver. Engagements were planned around visibility, not movement. Success was measured by confirmed kills at range, not by territory seized. The effect on enemy forces was immediate but uneven. Soviet and Allied units learned quickly to avoid frontal approaches. They attempted flanking maneuvers, artillery suppression, and closer range ambushes. But these adaptations required coordination, time, and favorable conditions, commodities often unavailable under fire. From the German perspective, this reinforced a dangerous conclusion, that as long as distance could be maintained, superiority was assured. This belief shaped tactical behavior in subtle ways. Crews lingered longer in exposed positions. They delayed repositioning after firing. Units became more static, more deliberate, less inclined to disengage quickly. The Tiger's gun invited patience. This patience, initially advantageous, carried a hidden cost. By privileging long-range dominance, Tiger units gradually deprioritized maneuver training. Exercises emphasized gunnery over movement. Recovery drills received less attention than firing tables. The tank was treated less as a component of a system and more as a solution in itself. This was not mandated from above. It emerged from experience. When a weapon consistently delivers results, it becomes authoritative. Crews trust it. Commanders plan around it. Institutions internalize it. By early 1943, this trust was reflected in German operational planning. Heavy tank battalions were increasingly assigned as anchors rather than exploiters. They were used to hold ground, to blunt advances, to restore stability in threatened sectors. This represented a departure from earlier German practice. Where armored units once created instability for the enemy, Tiger units now provided stability for German lines. They absorbed pressure rather than generating momentum. Their presence reassured neighboring units, even when the broader situation deteriorated. The Tiger had become a psychological perimeter. At the same time, the gun's effectiveness reinforced a simplifying assumption, that technological superiority could indefinitely offset numerical and material disadvantage. As long as German tanks could destroy enemy armor before it could respond, the imbalance of production and manpower could be managed locally. This assumption held under certain conditions. Clear weather. Open terrain. Adequate fuel. Functional optics. Trained crews. But it was fragile. Reports from mid-1943 began to note increasing instances where Tigers were neutralized not by direct fire, but by indirect means, artillery barrages, air attack, mechanical failure during repositioning. These incidents were recorded, but often treated as exceptions rather than indicators. The gun still worked. The armor still held. The model appeared intact. What was changing, slowly, was the environment. Enemy forces adjusted doctrine. New guns were introduced. Engagements became more complex. The battlefield filled with variables that range alone could not eliminate. Yet the Tiger encouraged a belief that these complications were secondary. The long arm of the 88 created distance, and distance created confidence. That confidence narrowed perception. By mid-1943, German armored warfare increasingly revolved around preserving favorable conditions rather than adapting to unfavorable ones. When conditions could not be preserved, engagements became riskier. When risk increased, reliance on the Tiger intensified. The solution became recursive. The Tiger had not merely changed how German forces fought. It had changed what they believed fighting required. From this point forward, German armored doctrine would increasingly assume that control came from range and protection, and that losing either meant losing the engagement. That assumption had not yet collapsed. But the space in which it could survive was shrinking. By the time the Tiger had proven itself on the battlefield, its influence no longer needed to be demonstrated through combat alone. It was being taught. In late 1942 and early 1943, as heavy tank battalions expanded and new crews were trained, the German army introduced a document unlike any other issued to armored forces during the war. It was officially a technical manual. In practice, it functioned as something closer to instruction through belief. The document was called the Tigerfibel. Unlike standard field manuals, the Tigerfibel did not rely on dense text or abstract diagrams. It used cartoons, rhymes, personification. It framed the Tiger not simply as a machine, but as a demanding presence, something that rewarded care and punished neglect. In one illustration, the Tiger was depicted as a woman, often referred to as Elvira, whose cooperation depended on proper treatment. Crews were instructed, through humor, that attention to maintenance, discipline, and procedure would keep her loyal. Mistakes were framed not as mechanical failures, but as breaches of trust. This framing was deliberate. By 1943, the German army was training increasingly young crews. Losses on the Eastern Front had accelerated. Veteran tankers were fewer. Replacement crews often arrived with limited experience and compressed training schedules. The Tiger, meanwhile, was complex, heavy, and unforgiving of error. The Tigerfibel addressed this problem not by simplifying the machine, but by reshaping how crews related to it. The manual emphasized that the Tiger would protect its crew, but only if it was respected. It discouraged reckless behavior, but it also reinforced a crucial assumption, that survival depended primarily on the machine's condition and capabilities, rather than on tactical flexibility. This was a subtle but significant shift. Earlier German doctrine placed the burden of survival on judgment, coordination, and movement. The Tiger era redistributed that burden. Protection was embedded in steel. Firepower was embedded in caliber. The crew's role was increasingly to preserve the system that preserved them. According to training records from 1943, heavy tank instruction prioritized maintenance routines, firing discipline, and positional awareness over maneuver drills. Crews were taught how to place the Tiger, how to angle it, how to present its strongest armor. They were taught how to wait. The Tiger was no longer just a weapon. It was an environment. This indoctrination had predictable effects. Crews developed a heightened sense of responsibility toward the machine itself. Damage reports often focused on mechanical condition rather than tactical outcome. Withdrawals were justified by the need to preserve the vehicle. Engagement decisions increasingly balanced opportunity against the risk of exposing the Tiger to unfavorable conditions. None of this was irrational. The Tiger was rare, expensive, and difficult to replace. By 1943, Germany could not afford to lose them casually. Preservation was a logical priority. But preservation also shaped behavior. In memoirs and post-war interviews, former Tiger commanders often described engagements in terms of what the Tiger could tolerate. Terrain was judged by load-bearing capacity. Weather was assessed for its impact on traction and visibility. Movement was planned to minimize stress on components. The battlefield was interpreted through the lens of the machine. This perspective narrowed tactical imagination. Options that would have been viable for lighter, more mobile units were often dismissed as too risky for the Tiger. Instead of adapting to circumstances, crews increasingly sought circumstances that suited the Tiger. This dependency was reinforced institutionally. Propaganda emphasized the Tiger's invincibility. Newsreels showed it advancing methodically, shells bouncing harmlessly from its armor. Kill tallies were reported prominently. The public was told, implicitly and explicitly, that Germany's technological edge remained decisive. This message was not aimed only at civilians. It circulated within the military itself. The Tiger became shorthand for reassurance. Its presence on a sector map implied stability. Requests for Tigers accompanied reports of enemy pressure. Commanders asked not for reinforcements in general, but for heavy tanks specifically. The belief was now systemic. The Tiger had been absorbed into German military culture not merely as a tool, but as an answer. It represented a way to manage fear, to impose order on a battlefield that had grown unpredictable. But the cost of that belief was becoming visible. By late 1943, Allied forces had adjusted. New anti-tank guns entered service. Air power intensified. Artillery concentrations increased. Tigers were increasingly disabled not through frontal penetration, but through indirect effects: tracks damaged, engines destroyed, recovery impossible under fire. When Tigers were lost, the impact was disproportionate. Not because of their numbers, but because of what they represented. Each loss challenged the assumption that protection was sufficient. Each disabled Tiger exposed the limits of reliance on steel alone. Crews adapted, but the adaptation often took the form of increased caution rather than renewed flexibility. The indoctrination had worked. Crews trusted the Tiger. Commanders relied on it. Institutions organized around it. And in doing so, German armored warfare had committed itself to a belief that was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The Tiger had made Germany feel invincible. Now, the war was preparing to ask what would happen when that feeling could no longer be maintained. By early 1944, the Tiger was no longer an experiment, nor a promise. It was an expectation. German armored planning assumed its presence the way earlier campaigns had assumed speed. This assumption shaped deployments, production priorities, and battlefield decisions, even as the conditions that had made the Tiger effective were eroding. The change was gradual, and therefore difficult to register in real time. On paper, the Tiger still dominated. Its armor remained formidable. Its gun could still destroy most Allied tanks at long range. In controlled conditions, the model held. But the war no longer offered controlled conditions. By the winter of 1943 to 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe had become decisive. Movement by day exposed vehicles to air attack. Rail transport was disrupted. Fuel shortages worsened. Recovery operations became increasingly dangerous. A disabled Tiger was no longer a temporary problem. It was often a permanent loss. Operational records from this period show a steady shift in how Tigers were lost. Fewer were destroyed outright by tank fire. More were abandoned due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or inability to recover under fire. The machine's strength, its weight, its complexity, now worked against it. This was not a failure of design. It was a failure of context. The Tiger had been built to dominate a battlefield defined by direct confrontation. The war that emerged by 1944 was defined by systems, air power, logistics, artillery coordination, and numerical pressure applied continuously rather than decisively. The Tiger could still win battles. It could no longer shape the war. German commanders recognized this, but recognition did not translate into reversal. Too much had already been invested, materially, doctrinally, psychologically. Heavy tanks had become central to German armored identity. Shifting away from them would have required not only industrial retooling, but a reassessment of belief. That reassessment did not occur during the war. Instead, Germany doubled down. The Tiger II entered service. Armor thickness increased again. Weight increased again. Protection was extended further in an attempt to restore certainty. The pattern repeated. Each increase in protection promised renewed safety. Each increase narrowed mobility, strained logistics, and reduced flexibility. The solution addressed the symptom, vulnerability, while deepening the underlying problem. By the summer of 1944, following the Allied landings in Normandy, German armored units faced a battlefield that negated many of the Tiger's advantages. Hedgerows limited range. Air attack constrained movement. Artillery saturated likely positions. Engagements unfolded at distances where armor superiority mattered less than coordination and volume of fire. Tigers fought, and fought effectively at times. But they did so as isolated instruments within a collapsing system. Post-war analyses conducted by Allied and German historians reached similar conclusions. The Tiger had been tactically formidable, but strategically misaligned. It solved the wrong problem. Germany's challenge was not the inability to destroy enemy tanks. It was the inability to sustain a war of scale. The Tiger addressed fear, not endurance. In memoirs written after the war, German officers often reflected on the reassurance the Tiger provided. They described the sense of control it restored, the confidence it inspired. These reflections were not triumphal. They were often quiet, even subdued. The machine had done what it was designed to do. It had made Germany feel invincible, at moments when invincibility mattered psychologically more than materially. But wars are not decided by feelings. They are decided by systems that persist under pressure. The Tiger could not compensate for shortages of fuel, manpower, air cover, and time. It could delay defeat locally, but it could not reverse it globally. What the Tiger revealed was not the power of superior technology, but but its limits. It showed how easily institutions under strain gravitate toward solutions that offer clarity and reassurance, even when those solutions narrow future options. By investing belief in armor and gun caliber, Germany committed itself to a path that grew increasingly brittle. When the environment changed, the belief did not adapt quickly enough. History did not judge the tiger as a failure. It judged it as a mirror. A reflection of a military searching for certainty in a war that no longer offered it. And by the time that reflection became clear, the war had already moved beyond the point where reassurance could matter. If you've made it this far, you understand that history isn't decided in a single moment. It's shaped by timing, hesitation, and the decisions people make when options begin to close. If this perspective speaks to you, consider subscribing for future episodes. As the war itself would prove, once events are set in motion, they rarely wait for permission.